Welcome to AntArctic Stories, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes into the rich world of people who live, work, and undertake daring expeditions in the polar regions. My name is Heather Thorkelson, and I'll be your host today. Alexander Feldt has spent the last decade working as an Arctic guide both on land and on expedition cruise ships in Russia's far north and northern Norway. Originally from Arkhangelsk on Russia's northern coast, he has a wide variety of unique expertise in this lesser traversed area of the Arctic. Alexander began his career as a guide for 4 seasons at the Solovetsky Monastery, a fortified monastery located on the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea in northern Russia. It was one of the largest Christian citadels in northern Russia before it was converted into a Soviet prison and labor camp in 1926 and served as a prototype for the camps of the Gulag system. Later, Alexander worked for 5 years as a specialist in the Department of Tourism in the Russian Arctic National Park, which involved 20 trips to the North Pole via Franz Josef Land on the nuclear icebreaker 50 Years of Victory, giving lectures and presentations about the park for guests from all over the world, as well as monitoring of ice, animals, and birds. His position with the national park required Alexander to liaise with various international tour operators, preparing agreements, plans, reports, and statistics, as well as translation of AECO rules. He was responsible for creating tourism routes, as well as materials for visitors to the Russian Arctic National Park, outlining the visitation guidelines. On top of that, he has organized international seminars and numerous museum and photo exhibitions. Alexander has degrees in history and circumpolar studies and has studied tourism from universities in both Russia and Norway. He has published 6 scientific papers in Russian about history and tourism. Furthermore, he speaks Russian, English, Norwegian, and a little French. Finally, Alexander runs a Facebook group called Pomory ne Pomoyka, or in English, The Russian North is Not a Dump, supporting the protest against Moscow garbage being dumped in the Russian north, and in support of recycling as an alternative. In his free time, Alexander likes to travel, meet friends, and sing songs. Welcome, Alexander Feldt, to AntArctic Stories.
Thank you.
So, your bio reads like a long, illustrious career in the Arctic, and yet you're only in your early 30s. Can you tell me how you became so passionate about history, tourism, and international cooperation in the Arctic of Russia?
Hi, everybody. I studied history in the university, and when I studied, I moved to Norway to study Bachelor in Circumpolar Studies, because I studied in Arkhangelsk, it's the city in the northern Russia. We have strong connections with Scandinavia, and in Norway I studied these Arctic stories in Bachelor of Circumpolar Studies, and after that I came to Tromsø and studied there, and finally after every course of studying, I visited Solovetsky archipelago as a guide. Huge stories of this archipelago camp for the prisoners during Soviet times, the Solovetsky monastery, beautiful nature, White Sea, so this northern region. And after the university, I came back to Norway once again and studied tourism there. And then after I returned to Russia, I began to work in the Russian Arctic National Park, and there finally all my interests, they were together: tourism, history, everything. And there for 5 years I combined my education, my experience, and also visited the high Arctic finally.
Excellent. So I'm very curious to hear a little bit more about this Solovetsky archipelago as well with the prison camp. That sounds like an interesting place to be during your studies. But we get a lot of guests on the podcast that talk about polar tourism, but we've not really had anyone who can give us a glimpse into the visitor activities in the Russian far north, which is your specialty. Many people don't even realize that it's possible, for example, to go to the North Pole on an icebreaker as a tourist. So the area that you know the best and that you worked in, we're looking at between the coast of Russia and the North Pole. We've got Franz Josef Land, we've got Novaya Zemlya. It's a lot of really special areas that are very untouched, particularly with Franz Josef Land, which is a pretty typical stop-off point on the way to the North Pole. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about the history of Franz Josef Land and why it's so interesting for people to visit there now?
Yes, sure. Franz Josef Land, it's the archipelago that was discovered only in the end of the 19th century, 1873, and it was covered by Austro-Hungarian expedition. And after that, there were many international expeditions there. So it's not only Russian archipelago, and it became Soviet actually only in 1920s.
Oh.
Before it belonged to nobody, similar to what Svalbard is now, but now it's Norway belongs to Norway, but there Franz Josef Land, and the name itself, it's Austro-Hungarian, the name Franz Josef Land, Emperor of Austro-Hungarian Empire. And also there are many islands. The archipelago consists of 192 islands. And what can be said that every island has a special name, and many of them are called by the international expeditions, by British expeditions, by Americans, and many historical pages are connected with the different countries. Therefore, it's very interesting for the visitors who are coming there now from all over the world. And then, after these first expeditions, after the people who tried to reach the North Pole through Franz Josef Land, most famous is Nansen, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Then, during the Soviet times, was military base there. At first, polar station. Then, after the Second World War, the military bases, several of them, they're part of the Cold War, the northern border of Soviet Union, and therefore, during the Cold War, Franz Josef Land was closed for the visitors, even for the Russians. Only in 1990s. We can say it was possible to visit the archipelago. If you compare it to the Svalbard and cities there, so Longyearbyen and airports and many visitors, thousands of them. And now Svalbard is, you can say, not so wild anymore. So people live there, people visit it. It's a tourist attraction. It's not for mass tourism, but still, polar bears, snow, people there. But what about Franz Josef Land? It's very difficult to reach it. So there's you can reach it by plane, but only the military base on Alexandra Land, one of the islands, and other places only by maybe helicopter from Alexandra Land. But there are not so many helicopters. There are no routes for the visitors to visit it by helicopter. You can use only boat, and comparing with the Svalbard, the sea is warmer there. And Franz Josef Land, everywhere is the ice, and you can visit it only during the summer. And even during the summer, it's possible to meet a lot of ice. So some ships, it's difficult for them to reach most of the islands, only the 1,000 part of archipelago, for example. And when you talk about the icebreaker, especially 50 лет Победы or 50 years of victory, it doesn't have such problems. Mm-hmm. So it can reach the North Pole. So, and on the way to the North Pole, you can visit some of the islands of archipelago, but only some of them, because you have 1.5 days during your trip. So if you really want to visit Franz Josef Land, you should use another boat. And still you have the problems because not so many boats, very difficult to reach. I mentioned ice, bureaucratic problems, new destination. So also Arctic tourism is not so cheap. So border problems with because there are border guards there, so you should receive the permission and so on and so forth. So not so many ships reach Franz Josef Land, maybe 10 of them a year usually. And these are not big ships, only 100 people on each. So around 1,000 people visiting Franz Josef Land, comparing with thousands of people, more than 70,000 people visiting Svalbard, the territory that is close to Franz Josef Land, but not so wild. Franz Josef Land is still wild. Polar bears most of them don't know people, and they are very curious, so they can come to the ships. There are many places that are not visited by people, so the nature, and at the same time many places visited previously. I mentioned the expeditions, so there are a lot of places to visit and to speak about and to enjoy the history, the nature, and the wildness. So therefore, you should visit Franz Josef.
You do a great job of selling it, especially for those people who really want to go to places most people don't get to go to. You know, we think of, even Svalbard is a place that most people, I would say the majority of people haven't heard of unless they've looked into polar tourism or unless they're interested in seeing polar bears or walruses, for example. Of course, even more people haven't heard of Franz Josef Land for the same reasons that you listed out. It is the Wild West of Arctic tourism. It is really hard to get to. And I've heard, of colleagues working on those smaller vessels that you mentioned, the 100-passenger vessels that aren't the icebreaker, and they've had Franz Josef Land as a destination, and then they couldn't get there because of the ice. And, it's really a special place for that region. And as you say, so many historical things to talk about and see, so many animals and teeming with wildlife that it isn't accustomed to humans at all. So it's definitely a special place. Now, what I think is so interesting about this, Alexander, is that because you worked for the national park and there are so few ships that go there, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what it was like to be sort of in those early stages of planning, or if you have some insight into how did the park manage the incoming tourism as it started to become a destination? Because unlike Svalbard, there are no site guidelines for visitors that we normally have in these regions. There's no places that you have to book in as I'm a tour operator, I'm going to come and visit this particular site. There's no one to answer to in that respect, at least not that I'm aware of. I'd love to hear your take on that. What are those early stages of planning for tourism like in that region?
Thank you for the question. The main idea that, as I mentioned, in 1990s, first ships came to Franz Josef Land, went to the North Pole. Nuclear icebreaker Yamal was before 50 Лет Победы that transported passengers to the North Pole, and on its way they visited Franz Josef Land, but there was no national park that time. So it was really, really wild, but so wild that nobody protected their territory. Everybody could do everything they wanted to do. So it was not good. And now in 2011, the first season of Russian Arctic National Park began. I started working in 2013 there, and that time there was a couple of expeditions, and the first rangers started working there for a couple of summers, because you can work there only during the summer. During the winter, mentioned it's not possible to reach it by the sea, so the ship. And there is the Alexanderland Island with and only one base of Russian Arctic National Park that you can visit all year round. But all the other 191 islands you can visit only during the summer, and this summer season from you can say June to September, 4 months. It's the working period. And during this period, the rangers of Russian Arctic National Park, not so many actually, on the whole, 35 people. Yeah. It's rather small national park with all the offices, services. So during the winter, They work in Arkhangelsk. It's the base. During the summer, there are some people. In addition, on the whole, can be 70 people during the season. Some of them accompany the ships, but the most important people are those who try to create something from Franz Josef Land, to reconstruct some bases, polar stations, to try to make this territory friendly to the visitors, at the same time not to destroy and not to make it a usual tourist destination. And there were several projects at the same time. First big project was cleaning of the Arctic. You know that from Soviet times, a lot of garbage on the military bases was left, and it had to be cleaned. So many transport vessels came there, and the workers, they cleaned it. They took all the fuel from the barrels, many barrels from the Soviet military bases, power stations, and they pressed the barrels, and they took it to the mainland, and after that recycled it. So much money, huge project, and good idea at the same time. Also, the places that passengers, that guests could visit, they were also dirty. So, for example, Buchta Tikhaya Bay polar station was conserved in 1956, and in 50 years nobody lived there. It was dirty, a lot of garbage. And what our rangers started doing, first they started cleaning, and they cleaned it. After that, they tried to take all the ice out of the buildings. They tried to reconstruct some of them. They lived only in a couple of the buildings, but it was a big polar station, very interesting for the visitors. And it's the main attraction, Franz Josef Land, Buchta Tikhaya polar station, that was functioning from 1929 to 1956, and people there studied Arctic, they had meteorological investigations, and huge history, very interesting buildings. Now many of them are reconstructed. Now it's becoming more and more the museum. And for instance, it's the process of becoming a museum was very interesting. The tour operators, the icebreaker, they helped our rangers to come there. So we bring our rangers on our way to the North Pole. They used the icebreaker. For example, the group of 4 disembarked there, and on the way back, people can see the result of their job. For example, you reconstructed building, a post office that you can visit, the northernmost post office there, and some eco trails that people could use. Most important point that as we already know, it's very wild. So polar bears, they live there. And comparing with the rules on Svalbard and it's a national park, Russian Arctic National Park, you cannot kill bear, even if it is close. We have, I think, you should be prisoned and 7 years in jail if you kill bear. But we are national park, so we were the national park, and you shouldn't kill bear. So, and they didn't. So our rangers, they lived in these houses, and bears were all around. They came, they used the calendar to tick the days when bears came, and every day they had this tick. Maybe some days were without these ticks. I remember these calendars, and they were all around. So they came, they went back, and the rangers could scare the bears, but they were not allowed to kill. So they lived inside this nature. They worked with the bears, and maybe I'm not sure if people know that polar bears are very dangerous animals. They can eat people for 12 minutes, and nothing is left. So people don't know who is human, but they are super predators. So they used to watch people as the food. Everything is the food for them. So after they got acquainted with the people, so if they were not hungry, it was good. But if they were, there could be problems. So all our rangers, they worked with the bears around, and at the same time, guidelines. So when we worked in the office, we cooperated with AECO. association of expedition cruise operators in the Arctic that operated everywhere besides Franz Josef Land, but then the companies that are in AECO, they visited Russian Arctic National Park, and they needed these guidelines, so we used the experience of AECO and the guidelines for Svalbard, and had the first 6 guidelines, but it's still not enough. The idea is to make more and more guidelines, because these territories need these guidelines, and a lot of many islands, many places can be visited. At the same time, still the national park, so not all the islands should be visited. They must be protected, because if 100 people land on the shore at once, they can destroy this vulnerable Arctic nature. So when we talk about this polar station, and very interesting place, and post office, and the reconstructed buildings, and some vehicles there, some tractors that you cannot find even on the mainland from the same times, it's one point. But when you come to the pristine island that nobody visited for 100 years or even never, you can easily destroy it. So we, as rangers, we accompanied the ships, watched the operators, the passengers, not to step on the shore, on the plants, not to destroy, not to make the situation when animals are afraid of people. So to follow, in short, to follow the AECO rules. So AECO has its rules, and the park became the part of AECO operators, the part of this AECO association. So these special rules for visiting Arctics, we started using them, and therefore the tourism became really ecotourism, not what was before. Before the park was established, when there were no borders. So at the same time, people could visit the wild territories, but not destroy them, and rangers accompanied the ships and reconstructed the attractions, created the museum to save what could be saved. Archaeological investigations are held at the same time. So it was at the same time during the tourist visitors. Even Chinese people helped to clean the Arctic. They helped to take the garbage and carried the garbage from the station when there was still garbage. So they were volunteers. It was the event for them. The passengers enjoyed it very much.
Nice. That's really awesome. I mean, and that's something that we, I think, in general, try to do in the Arctic, is get passengers involved in cleaning things up, because we get a lot of, over in Svalbard as well, which isn't too far away from Franz Josef Land, we get a lot of not original garbage left over from old times, but just plastic garbage and things that wash up. So it's always good to get everyone involved in keeping these places clean and pristine. But I just think it's so fascinating to hear, all the efforts that have gone into protecting this area, to restoring her. I mean, that's a lot of dedication on part of the rangers to be going up there, hitching a ride basically on the icebreaker and getting dropped off, and then doing all this work while there are polar bears wandering around, that's amazing. What I'm wondering about is, are you allowed to use deterrents for polar bears? So when the rangers are up there doing this kind of restoration work, can you use flare guns? Can you use pepper spray? Is there anything you can do to just frighten the bears away so that they don't try to come and eat you?
The best way is to wait until the bear goes its own way, so not to disturb the bear. It's the best way to notice the bear before it notices you, but not always was possible. So yes, certainly there were possibilities to scare the bear, the flare guns. The problem is that they do not always react on the flare guns. When we talk about the guns, rangers there use the hunting guns, and that they are not used to kill, so they use shells to scare, to shoot close to the bear. Part of the rangers, they were hunters before they started to work in the national park. Interesting combination, but still, so they were used to use the guns properly, so they could use it not to kill the bear, so just to scare it, and it worked. So no bears were killed, and
That's excellent.
so there were bears that died, and was during the construction of the new military base on the Alexandra land, and another one was before Russian Arctic National Park. Was on Hayes Island, where meteorologists lived. And so during the work of our rangers, during our the tourist visits, no bear were killed, and best weren't to notice them before. But for the rangers, it was difficult because, as I mentioned, they were living with them, so they could scare the best friend just to scare, to show that it's not that the bear shouldn't come there, but they came, they continued to come, so they were not so scared, and so therefore all the time they had to carry the gun. They had to carry the gun, so always with the gun on the shoulder, even during they were working. So all the time had to be very attentive.
Yeah, very attentive to say the least. Wow. So, and you mentioned as well that, that AECO guidelines have been adopted, which are the, standard guidelines for tourism across most of the Arctic. And that's really wonderful that those are not only adopted, but reinforced by always having rangers, on board with passengers and guiding passengers around. It just shows the level of dedication of both wanting to highlight how incredible this region is and also equally protect it. Now, the Russian Arctic National Park is massive, and it includes both the territories of Franz Josef Land and Novaya Zemlya, and some other areas as well. I'm curious, Alex, you worked there for about 5 years. What would you say were your biggest challenges in working for the park?
So you're right, the big territory, not only Franz Josef Land archipelago, but Novaya Zemlya archipelago, and I think it's the part of it. So not all the archipelago, the northern part, because on the southern part there are still military bases and cities, but the northern part is belongs to national park, and it's difficult to visit it, even more difficult than Franz Josef Land. Only on the way through the Eastern Passage, the ships that go all the way from Chukotka to Norway, for instance, they visit Novosibirsk Islands, island of Wrangel, also Novaya Zemlya archipelago, the archipelago that was visited by Barents, and Barents died there. And also there was Polar Station, the same Soviet during the Soviet times, and Pomo fishermen came there in the 19th century. So also the archipelago with beautiful nature and big history. Not so many islands, but the walruses, the animals, the beluga whales. You can't find narwhal there. Narwhal is, you can find only Franz Josef Land archipelago, and narwhal is the symbol of Russian Arctic National Park.
Wow.
My challenges. So I didn't work there as a ranger. I wasn't on this basis. Only heard the stories from my friends about the bears who came during the night to the house and ate the bucket of cabbage. But luckily not the people that were sleeping in the room near this bucket of cabbage. But for me and the visitors, we landed for a couple of hours or maximum 4 hours, had a perimeter, tried to notice the bear, and then we noticed it and told everybody go back to the ship, and that was all. So I didn't even shoot the bear during this landing. During these landings, we had to take care of the people. So we were watching before the landing. We used the helicopter on there was the helicopter on the icebreaker to watch the territory, and if we noticed the bears, then we canceled the landings. If we the footsteps, the trails of the bears, we canceled the landings. So we're very careful. And but it's Arctic, and you cannot be too careful. It can be so there can be different situations. For instance, when during the first season there was a fog. The fog is common this archipelago, and you couldn't see further than 30 meters.
Wow.
And the icebreaker tried to reach the destination. It didn't have too much time, so they hurried up. It was the end of the summer, and people were thinking that, oh, the ice melted down, and nothing could happen. But there were icebergs in the Negev Straits, and the icebreaker had a radar and was an ice on the radar, but it didn't show the height of the ice. And it was big iceberg to the right. They tried to escape from one iceberg and met another one.
Oh, no.
So it was foggy, so luckily nobody was outside, and nobody was hurt. And one man was outside. He ran away from the iceberg. And similar to Titanic, to the right side, the starboard side, destroyed all the things on the top. Huge strike, and you can still see this meeting with the iceberg. If you watch the icebreaker, they didn't repair because it bumped, and you can see this point of meeting the iceberg.
Wow.
And they had to repair everything on the top, several millions of rubles afterwards. But that time people were in front of the ship. They heard the big bomb. The helicopter pilots that in their cabin had to take all the ice from their cabin because the window was opened, and all the ice from the iceberg came to the cabin. It was huge.
Oh my
gosh. It was higher than the icebreak. In fact, 100 years after the Titanic, so now the situation with the security is better. So the icebreaker continued its way, and even the landings. So everything was fine, and but still very interesting situation.
Yeah.
Me myself, I heard the sounds, and it was all. And after that, I watched the video.
Yeah.
And from the cameras, and it was enough for me. And but another interesting case was when we visited the northernmost point of Eurasia, the Cape Fligely, and Rudolf Island, the northernmost island of Franz Josef Land, the island where the people tried to use to start their way to the North Pole. Nothing interesting there besides the northernmost point and the wind, the cross that is put there. Big plateau, maybe 20 meters above the sea, and the sea was covered under the ice. So we used helicopter. The helicopter is rather small, only 5 people inside. We had more than 100 passengers, and also the rangers and the expedition team. And so maybe around 40 passengers were ashore when suddenly the fog came. And as I mentioned, it's often there. So if you visit Franz Josef Land, be prepared that all the days you will be inside the fog and see nothing. It can happen. And then suddenly the fog came. It can come in 10 minutes, very fast, and stay the whole day long. And only 20 meters could see in front of you. And then we were left because helicopter couldn't reach us. Zodiacs couldn't reach us. We had expedition team. We had 4 rangers with guns, with the shells, and just in case with the bullets. But still, we couldn't see anything, and it was really dangerous because the Cape Fligely is the good place for the polar bears. The year before, with the National Geographic expedition, we saw a couple of bears there, even 3 bears there at least, and then the year after we saw bears there But that time, maybe we didn't see them. Maybe there was good wind, because polar bears, they use the wind to smell the people and the things that are interesting for them. But still, we were there with the passengers from India that were thinking that, okay, so we can walk 1 hour. They used the jackets without anything besides these jackets. That's no layers at all. Maybe in India, so only on jacket they had jacket. It was enough for them, and so it was really cold for them. Even we had tents. The expedition team had tents. They used it, and still really cold. So people started to dance, Jimmy Jimmy, Acha Acha, traditional Indian dances from Bollywood movies, just to keep us warm. But because we didn't know when we could leave this place. But then the pilots, it's great pilots. Alexander, before he used to fly in Africa during the civil wars there, so very professional one. So he broke all the rules, and he used to say, and he saved us. And when it was little window in this fog, and he saved us after more than 6 hours we stayed there, and was adventure for the passengers. They came to the bar, they drank wine there, but just think about what could happen if bears came, if there was no window in the fog, because maybe no villages there, no cities, no special security services, emergency services. It's a big problem for this territory. Even on Svalbard, we have them, but not just adventure. And luckily, we managed to.
No kidding. I mean, you were on the world's most powerful icebreaker, and you hit a giant iceberg that was higher than the icebreaker itself, and you got stranded for 6 hours in the fog with no hope of rescue in really dense polar bear country. I mean, there's not a lot of people that can say they've been through something like that. That's really wild. Oh my goodness. I've got to ask, how fast would the icebreaker have been going when you hit that iceberg in your first story?
18 knots. I think was 18 knots, really fast. It was on a hurry. It's not. It's prohibited to use this speed. Why? You can see why. So it's the rules. And, that was the result.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. And yeah, I can imagine the porthole windows being smashed in and all this ice coming in from the iceberg. That's not something that the helicopter pilots will soon forget, whose rooms was filled with this ice. That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing those stories. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are so exciting to hear about, and you only really hear from people who spend a good amount of time in these far reaches of the world. I want to switch gears for a minute here, because I wanted to ask you about something you're involved in. Obviously, you used to work for the national park, but now you have a Facebook group that, in English, the title of this Facebook group is something along the lines of "The Russian North is not a dump." And I'm really curious about where that started from. And also, have you received criticism for creating a Facebook group around that?
Oh, it's another side of my life, kind of a hobby. To protest against authorities in Russia is kind of a hobby now, very dangerous. Maybe I'm not sure what is more dangerous, Arctic or this kind of protests. And still me and my friends, we started to be in opposition to our authorities a couple of years ago. And there were some protests against different reformers in Russia, against the authorities. But then suddenly, last summer, they decided to create a huge landfill in Arkhangelsk region and to use it for the garbage from Moscow. So not for our own garbage, but from Moscow garbage.
Oh, no.
And it's a big problem in Russia, the recycling. So only 5% of the garbage is recycled and being recycled. And so we are like in the Middle Ages there when we talk about problem. And comparing with Europe, for instance, we have a big territory, and that's what we used it for the garbage. But still, Moscow is so big and getting bigger and bigger, and it has so much garbage that the territories around Moscow, they cannot be used for storing the garbage anymore. So too much of it. And they tried to find the place. They tried to use different regions. And finally they decided, okay, Russian North, nobody is living there. The territory of the region is the same as France is, but the quantity of people in France is 60 million people, in Arkhangelsk region 1.5 million people, mostly living in Arkhangelsk and the northern part of the region, but the southern parts, just villages, some places. And they decided to start creation. First, they said that, oh, nothing happens, nothing at all, no garbage will be produced. Then they said that, okay, we have some money from Moscow. It's big investments, the development of economy, the recycled super modern techno park, they called it. So, but the thing is that they do not recycle it. They do not plan to recycle. They plan to make the landfill maybe more modern than the usual landfills, but very big. And at the same time, the whole problems of the landfills happen. So I was close to ecology in the Russian Arctic National Park. I saw the huge project of cleaning the Arctic when they took the barrels, the fuel, and transported it to the mainland. And here they start destroying the wild nature, the forests, southern part, and also at the same time, from the south of region, there are many swamps, and sometimes the protesters use Shrek as a symbol because it's our swamps. And through the swamps, through the rivers, many rivers there, all the waste, all the garbage can destroy the ecosystem of the whole region and even of the Arctic. And we are very afraid of it. So we started to protest in autumn and then created the groups in social nets. I am now in St. Petersburg, but I understand that this problem is for my family, my friends, and also Moscow can send the garbage anywhere, and it's the problem of everybody. I'm not sure if people in Europe take care of it. They have different problems. In Arctic, different problems with Russia, their own problems. So it's not their business, but still, we think people should know. And the articles in the New York Times, in Barents Observer, in Washington Post, some big newspapers talked about Shies, the place where the landfill should be constructed, and these Moscow garbage problems, the protests in Arkhangelsk, huge protests, more than 10,000 people, you can say at once in Arkhangelsk, the protests that are not allowed by the authorities. They're afraid of it. The governor is called a garbage governor in the territory. Yesterday, the day before yesterday, on the industry where the nuclear submarines are constructed, their workers, they put the banner with the president, Mr. President's just put the governor out of the region.
Wow.
Fire our governor. So, and really big event. I'm not afraid of it because Facebook group is not so big as the groups in the other social networks. I'm not the active participant of the protests anymore. I'm in St. Petersburg, and mainly the main protests are in Arkhangelsk. My job is not connected with the Arkhangelsk problems, and maybe if I continue working in Russian Arctic National Park, then something could happen. And many people that take part in these protests, they are self-employed. It's the best option. But still they receive the penalties after the protests. People who struggle against the workers in the place where the polygon, the landfill is under construction. They are in conflict with the workers there, and it's a big conflict, and still in process. The process of construction is going on. Today, people made the video for Putin, just Putin, can you hear us? And so Syktyvkar, the Komi Republic, is close to this landfill. I think we can hear about this problem even in future.
It's very heartening to hear that there are so many people willing to stand up and protest against things like that. Do you think that based on the volume of people who are against things like this giant landfill, do you think that there's a hope that they can actually effect change and do something about this? Do you feel like there's real power in the people?
From my point of view, it's the only way to do something here and to attract the attention of the media. That's what they did, to use the lawyers, the lawyers who can help, and the protesters, they use them to have good organization, and they have very
Mm.
organizers that can help, that can organize different people from different parts of the region. And more and more from the autumn, from November, every rally, every protest, more and more people coming, more and more people asking, more and more people all around the region. 18 places. I compared it with France. So even then, more than Juliet Jones, the 6th of April, there were protesters in Arkhangelsk region. So even more than in Paris. They should hear the construction process is stopped now because of the people living there. Watchmen in Shies watch can be called, just people that change each other coming from the villages that are close. They do not allow the tracks to bring the fuel there to continue the construction process. And now governor says that I'm not the one who creates it. It's not me. There's no project yet. There are no ecologists who can say that everything is fine. So still they can cancel it because Russia is big. But the main problem that then they try to find another place where it's not so many people who can organize themselves, who have the help of the lawyers, and who can attract the attention of media. But we will see.
There's power in numbers, and if you can get people to rally, then it's something, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the more remote they go, the less power local people have. So I certainly hope that comes to a good resolution. I suppose somewhat related to this, and maybe you already answered this question, but I'd love to hear how you feel about the future of the Russian North, where you're from and north of there. How do you feel about the future, and also what would you like to see improve?
So the Russian North is my homeland. So it's I was born in Arkhangelsk. I used to the cold temperatures and skis and these Arctic things. Yes, the beautiful Arctic nature and forests that are more to the south. Arkhangelsk region is big and there are different, but still wild nature that can be also interesting for the people. Maybe not so rich people as used to visit the North Pole, but can come to Arkhangelsk and find out something interesting for them. The big museum of wooden architecture, beautiful big river covered the ice. So Arkhangelsk region should be the region for the visitors. And I know many people from the US, from Norway, not many, but I know some people who came, who studied there, who enjoyed Arkhangelsk very much, enjoyed Arkhangelsk region and the nature and the people there. We have people. So Russia on the whole is not so open for the visitors. Arkhangelsk region, moreover, is not so open. So it should be open more. It should develop not as a place for the landfills, for the garbage, but the place that can develop itself. We have nuclear submarines industry. We have good industries. We have good Northern Arctic Federal University. We have many people. The main problem in the north, I know, for example, for Scandinavia, that not so many people live in the north of Norway. Not so many people in Arkhangelsk. We have 360,000 people living there. 200,000 people living in Severodvinsk. Or the Arctic for the visitors. The north for the sustainable development, not for the garbage, but for the interesting new technological development, for the intellectual development. The thing that I think it's important for Russia on the whole. But the Russian North can be. We had good historical roots. The Pomors lived there. The fishermen, the free fishermen, and the very people that very strong, and they could deal with the nature, the cold winters, and that's what people can continue to do now. I used to live in this high north to deal with all kind of problems they have there, and still they are very kind and hospitable. So I hope that everything will be fine there.
Well, you're an excellent ambassador for the region. And, this has been a theme in many of the podcast interviews that I've done that, because we're talking about these regions that people don't normally visit, the polar regions, the Russian North, it's very true that we're not motivated to care about or to protect places unless we have gone there and seen it for ourselves. Generally speaking, we're not as motivated. Once you've been there and you see the beauty and you experience the people and the hardiness and the hospitality, it really changes everything. And speaking as someone from Canada, from quite far away from Russia, I always think of Russia as sort of somewhat of an inaccessible country. Like, I imagine it's hard to, as you say, it's not really open to tourism. And that just makes me want to see it more. But that also means that non-Russians don't understand Russia, and we don't understand what we're missing. And we certainly, after what you've told us, don't understand what we're missing of the Russian far north. So I really hope that folks who are listening to this podcast episode feel excited to learn more, and for people who are really into off-the-grid adventures, that they want to book a trip and go check out Arkhangelsk or go up to Franz Josef or even the North Pole, which is a pretty big bucket list place to go to. So thank you so very much for sharing all your stories today. I have one last question, and is that, do you have any cause or initiative that you want to give a shout out to?
I think this problem with Shies now is the most important thing. We try to motivate people to support this protest, to show that they are with us somehow all over the world, that they know about this problem. We know the people in Oslo, they went on the streets and the posters with them, the banners. So if anyone here can go and write down save Shies or just save Russian North or leave Russian North clean or anything else, and take a photo of it and send it to me or my friends in Facebook, anywhere else, it would be really great, because people feel these supports, people in Arkhangelsk region and their Shies. So that's kind of initiative, if I understand your question right.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, it allows people to say that they stand in solidarity with you in keeping the Russian North clean. So we'll make sure that we link to your Facebook group in the show notes. And if anyone wants to take a picture of themselves saying, keep the Russian North clean and send it to you, they can do that and stand in solidarity with you. That's really, really great. So again, thank you so much for your time. And we hope to have you on the podcast again sometime, Alexander.
Thank you very much for this possibility.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Antarctic Stories. If you like the stories we bring to you, please subscribe for future episodes. And if you want to help the podcast, leaving a rating or review greatly assists us in reaching a wider audience. Antarctic Stories is a production of Twin Tracks Expeditions, your experts in small ship expedition cruises to the Arctic and Antarctica. We love sharing our insider knowledge to help you find the perfect ship for your next polar expedition. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or at twintracksexpeditions.com.